Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the CSU Gender Summit. Thank you so much for being here. You all went to the peripheries of the room, so it's like, hello in a distance. I am Corey Wong, and I serve as Assistant Vice President for Gender Equity in the Office of the Vice President for Diversity. I also am the Director of the Women in Gender Collaborative, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for coming to the second day of the Gender Summit, where this morning we're going to be doing plenary sessions to give you some information on some key topics that hopefully will support the work that you're all doing on campus. But before we get too much further, I just always want to thank the LSC staff for being so supportive of putting on this event, and also the VPD staff for making this actually a reality and having it work. Our lovely panelists and presenters, 3 of whom you see here right now, but we will be seeing for the rest of the morning, and then of course all of you for being here to make this a thing. If you would please mark your attendance on the attendance sheets that are on your table in the white column. That'll help us keep track of who's attending these sessions. I also want to let you all know that these are going to be recorded so that we can share them as future resources. So if you have questions that you want to be asking the panelists in the morning, feel free to. That's of course welcome, but know that we'll be recording your questions, and that could live on for eternity. But for another side of that would be that you can hopefully use these as resources to share them within your units or to help continue the conversations around these topics. And then in your programs on page 10 and 11, we have spaces in there for you to be writing notes if that is helpful for you, so that you can be jotting down different ideas or questions or thoughts and things that you might be able to apply to the work that you're doing on campus. So a little bit about the plenary sessions too. The topics that we selected are hopefully going to be really interesting to you. We have selected topics that we think are critical for anybody doing gender equity on campus to be aware of and conscious enough about so that that can inform the work that they're doing. So the topics this morning are going to be intersectionality and supporting women of color, understanding the trans and non-binary community so that we can actually show up for people of all genders, and then things to know about Title IX. So that's a little bit of the rundown for this morning. And this morning, we're talking about intersectionality and women of color. So I will start with a little bit of a rundown of what intersectionality is in case people aren't familiar with that, just to set us up, and then we'll have the panelists introduce themselves. But for, especially in higher ed spaces, more and more it seems, the word intersectionality is being used a lot, and people I think are understanding that in order to do any kind of good feminist social justice or equity work, our approaches and our lenses have to be intersectional, but that might not resonate if people don't understand really the root of intersectionality and what it means. So it's important to recognize the history of where this came from. With Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, she coined the term intersectionality, but for decades before even that term was a thing, women of color especially had been saying, we cannot be a part of a movement that doesn't acknowledge the fact that our experiences are influenced not just by gender alone, but by so many other things. So race and ethnicity, class, ability, sexuality, all of these different elements of our identities intersect in ways that necessarily shift the experiences that one has and the understandings that one can bring to bear on those issues that are relevant. So if we want to be talking about gender equity at CSU, a helpful way that I like to think about it is that we can't be addressing the mainstream marginalized, like just those who have more dominant or privileged identities and under a subgroup, like by gender. But if we want to be effective, we should be attending to the needs and listening to the voices of those who are on the margins of the margins. So if we are doing good gender equity work, then that would be those who are like low-income women or women with disabilities, people with additional dependent care responsibilities. We could talk about women of color and what that looks like. And this came up a little bit yesterday in our healing and repair session, when even in the comments what people were sharing, saying, it's really hard for me to separate my gender and my race to know if the harm that I've experienced is actually because of one or the other. They're together necessarily. So that's a little bit of an idea of what intersectionality is to help us all be thinking about how, when we're doing our programming, we can't just assume that we're talking about, say, women in general, but we have to be conscious of the fact that different people have different experiences and we should be attending to those if we're going to be effective. So as you go about your programming and recommending across campus with however you engage in this, please keep this in mind. And then as we're talking and sharing with the panel, you can take notes and ask questions of like, am I doing this well then? Or what would that actually look like for me? And that's kind of what we hope for this to do. So now I would like for the panelists to do just a quick brief introduction for yourself, and then we can have a little short conversation about how we can best support women of color on campus. Would you like to start?
Hello, I'm Rachel Johnson. I work in the Walter Scott Junior College of Engineering as the recruitment director for undergraduate students. I graduated from CSU in 2012 with a degree in ethnic studies and women's studies. Anything else you want me to share right now? Okay.
Good morning. My name is Stephanie Z. I use she, her pronouns. I work in university housing as the coordinator for diversity and inclusion.
Salud. My name is Carmen Rivera. I work for the Division of Student Affairs doing talent management and organizational development, and I've been on campus for a long time. My pronouns are she and her.
Okay, thank you all for that. So I asked the panelists to just start with something very simple, which are 3 things that they wish that people knew and understood or feel very strongly that people on campus should know about how to best support women of color. So this is super informal. Just if there's any little tidbits of information or things that you feel like people don't often appreciate or you wish more people could understand that, what would those things be, and then how would that shape like things differently in terms of what we do around gender equity? Anybody want to start?
Happy to start. So this question was actually pretty high pressure, and I think that that's a little bit telling. It's a great question, Corey, but it's a little high pressure to think about. Okay, just 3 things, you know, because there's so much, and then you want to make sure to talk about things that you might not read in a book or that might not be general knowledge. And then I start thinking about, well, what is really general knowledge? Because it seems like things that I would think are obvious are not always obvious to other people. So I was thinking about this a lot over the last couple of weeks since Corey asked me to be on this panel, and came up with my own answers, but then I also did a little bit of crowdsourcing of my closest friends who all identify as either women or femmes of color, kind of curious about their responses. And the overwhelming response that I got from my friends and colleagues was, I don't have the energy to even think about that or answer that question, which I think really underscores the first point that I wanted to make, which is that do your own research, because this is exhausting. It's really exhausting and emotionally can be pretty draining to have to do this kind of education. So it's really, really important to do your own research so that you're not always asking women and femmes of color to be the ones educating you. I am a Native American woman, but there are, you know, when you consider all the federally recognized, state recognized, and tribes that have lost their recognition, over 600 tribes in this country alone, and so I can't represent a Native perspective. I can only represent my own perspective, so it's really important that you're doing your own research. The second thing I would say is I tend to not want to be involved in gender-related programming unless women of color, and especially queer and trans women of color, are really centered in that work. When you're centering queer and trans women of color, you're going to be doing good for all women and femmes. When you're not, then you're probably not going to be, you're going to be making an impact on white women and leaving out women of color. And so for me, I'm not interested in being involved in initiatives or efforts or programs or events that don't center queer and trans women of color. And it needs to be a meaningful inclusion as well. So a lot of times this happens where some group in Fort Collins will plan an event, usually related to Native American Heritage Month, and we get looped in about a week before the event saying, oh, hey, you should come to this, and we want to collaborate with you. Well, that's not a collaboration if you're letting us know a week before to boost your attendance at your event. That's not a collaboration, so be really thoughtful about how you include folks in your collaborations and your plans. And then the last thing is just be aware of microaggressions and other dynamics that are impacting women and femmes of color, especially on campus, and get skilled in being able to call those things out. It gets pretty exhausting in the work environment to always be the one who's known as the one that has something to say, the one that's always pushing back. That gets pretty tiring. And so one of the things I really appreciate about my current work environment is I've got a handful of really great colleagues that are really good at naming dynamics so that I'm not always the one. Really great white women colleagues that I appreciate because they do that.
We're all like, who's gonna go? Okay. So right before this, it's funny. I asked Corey, I'm like, so is there a lane I need to stay in? Like, do I need to kind of be mindful? And Corey was like, no, but you are being taped. Just remember that. And I was like, okay, because I don't know, it was like super. Like, so I'm really glad Rachel went first. I'm like, oh, okay, good. And like, I'm on the right track. So I did think of this. I actually came back to Denver really late last night. I was in California visiting my family, so on the drive home at like around midnight, I was like, okay, let me think about what I'm going to answer today. And so I got really fired up. So this is probably where this is coming from. But a lot of what Rachel said, I also co-sign. And then I have my 3 things too. So the first one is there's a really great poem by Pat Parker. And I'll read you like a couple of lines. But the poem is called "For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend." And the first 2 lines I remember hearing them when I was in grad school, and they've really stuck with me. So the lines are, the first thing you do is to forget that I'm black. Second, you must never forget that I'm black. And I say that because I don't, and I teach this semester a course in through ethnic studies, and we were talking about a film and whether or not it was an Asian film experience or, whatever, because the director is Chinese and the actors are also Asian. And a student pointed out, which was like really profound, she pointed out to say like, well, that filmmaker is never gonna be known as just this filmmaker. He's always gonna be known as the Asian filmmaker because that's how it is, right? Like, because white is the norm and the standard and everything else is not. And I was like, wow, like, yes, that is, you're just reminding me of everything. So thinking about that and the women and femmes of color that you work with or when we come to work or when we show up, we bring our whole selves in here. And so I don't need folks to remind me that I'm Chinese or Asian, right? I know that myself. And at the same time, I also need folks to not forget that I am. And so when we're sitting in a meeting and I leave and you're like, maybe folks are feeling differently and you see someone else walking out and you're like, why are they responding that way? You have to remember that they came in with all these identities that you also don't have. And so the room, they're impacted differently. And I have times like just like Rachel, I have great colleagues that realize that, but then I also have some that don't get that and wonder why, and then it's chalked up to being other things like you're being really sensitive, or maybe you misinterpret that, and it's no, I didn't. I need you to know it was impacted differently. My second thing that I wrote is emotional labor. I think women and femmes, right, we carry a lot, whether in our roles, so whether we're parents or partners or whatever we hold, we carry a lot of emotional labor. And so I think the added layer of being a woman of color and that emotional labor I carry is, again, like going back to what I just said about, not forgetting who I am and, right, like I carry all of that. So I think back to a meeting last week that I was in, and in the middle of like our process, people wanted to change it. And I was like, we just talked about this. I've been telling you about this for the last 3 months, right? But whatever I had established was disregarded and talked about as if I weren't, like literally they were having conversation on how to change the process in front of me while like it was my process, right? And so I'm trying to navigate, how do I navigate this space? How do I still remain professional? How do I still like talk to my colleagues and be collaborative? But at the same time, I'm really angry because I just checked in with all of you to make sure we were all on the same page. And I think right there, that was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and I actually ended up walking out of the meeting because I was really upset. But now I have to also think back to like what damage have I done, right? All these things that like the emotional labor of me carrying, like, okay, did I offend my colleague? But now I'm also upset because no one's respecting my position, and then I still have to go into a one-on-one with the student, right? I don't get to like take a time out. I don't get to say, you know what, I'm done for the day. I don't want to do this anymore. I have to continue working, right? I have to like show up still the next day, because if I don't show up, I don't like, right, I always think about who will, for my students, for the staff that need me. So I think about just something to keep in mind is like the emotional labor that we all carry, but then also extra for women and femmes of color. And then the last thing is thinking about things, movements, so like feminism, body positivity, etc. And kind of like what Rachel was saying, like those things weren't necessarily designed for women and femmes of color and trans women of color as well, right? They're centered on whiteness. And so thinking about like everything, right? Trainings we do. We did a training in the early January, and a lot of feedback that was received was, well, why didn't the facilitator you know, right, really like work on educating the white people and like come for them about like when they were doing something wrong. And what he actually did was something we don't witness a lot, was he empowered all of the people of color in the room. And we don't do that very often. And so thinking about what you have in your office or departments around these topics, who are they intended for? And then, right, asking for folks of color, particularly women of color, to show up and then kind of be part educating. I mean, my role is the coordinator for diversity and inclusion, so I don't get a pass right there. Like, I have to do the job. And I also recognize, like, that's a lot of pressure for me. And I think about that too, combining all the things of, if I mess up, how much more does that weigh on me than for somebody else, right? Because I have that title and I'm supposed to know better, but I'm learning just as much as everyone else. So just those are things to think about. But I think you being here is really telling, and listening, and appreciate the time that you've given us to talk about this.
Cool. Thank you. I took notes on what y'all said so I could like make sure that I can expand on what you all said, because I agree with everything that they've shared. It's been my experience, of folks that I have worked with and known and have in my community. So my 3 things, I came up with 3 things, right? I'm gonna tell you what they are so that you can remember, because my speech teachers say preview, say, re-say what you just said and previewed. So the first one is to expect mistrust from women of color, and that is okay. The second one is to do your learning, do your own learning. And then the third is to expand rather than reduce. Okay, those are the 3. So the first one, expect mistrust. When I think about any of my own dominant identities, as a Christian-raised person, as an able-bodied person, if I'm working with folks who have an oppressed identity or have less access to power and influence and being seen as the norm than me, and they come up to me and say, oh, I expected you to be different, that's okay, because that's the way the norm is, right? And so if I think about white folks and how allies can be in this work, is to not be surprised when women of color are like, oh, I didn't enter this relationship trusting you. That is not about you as the person, you in front of me. It's about a socialization and experience over the course of my lifetime that has led me to enter relationship with people from a place of like, oh, you're cool, I'll cool, you know, like we'll come do this work with you. And there's a certain level of mistrust because of the harm that has existed in our life. That does not mean, again, that we can't work together, we can't overcome that, we can't build trust. But a lot of times I think in relationship, and particularly in a work relationship, and I would say particularly for me in my own experience, it has been with white women where we feel like we often have the entry place of gender, but then we have a lot of really weird and funky experiences around race that make it be that we don't have this like nice smooth sailing relationship, right? And so if we can enter a space of saying it's okay to have somebody feel like they don't automatically on the jump trust me, that's okay, and that we can move on from there. I feel like that actually helps us build better relationship to allyship and to being an accomplice to really address issues of racism and sexism and all the other isms together if we know that we have to kind of work to earn somebody's trust in the first place. So do your learning is the responsibility kind of connected to what these folks have said around you having as allies in this work to do your fair share. I just saw a meme yesterday or day before yesterday about emotional labor, and it looked like a male identified person talking to a woman identified person saying something like, what is emotional labor? And the woman said something like, oh, it's having to explain to you what emotional labor is when you could have just Googled it, right? And so like, how is it that we use the technologies that we have accessible to us, even if it's your own friends or somewhere, like the people that you can ask questions of, Google, televisions, Netflix, documentaries, right? Lots of things. Read books. There are a lot of really great books that are like out right now. White Fragility. If you have not read that, read that. It's really good. I read it. I'm not white. And I was like, dang, I can connect that to a lot of my dominant identities, a lot of the places where I have privilege. Okay, cool. I got that. Made that connection, right? Read Presumed Incompetent. It's a whole thick volume of women of color stories in higher ed and how they have been treated in the academy, as staff, how they have not been seen. I had to read it in parts because it literally made me feel so heavy because I could see myself, I could see my colleagues, I could see my friends in their stories, right? So read those kinds of things. Go to conferences. We get the benefit of professional development oftentimes in our departments. Go. What if it means for you to not go to an academic conference, but maybe go to the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, or go to Creating Change, or go to something else that helps you understand the intersections of these spaces, right? Last one, I'm getting preachery, is to expand rather than reduce. Oftentimes I hear like, I'll get questions like, what is the woman of color experience? And I'm like, whoa. I mean, that's a lot of people to ask to whittle down the capital T experience for women, right? Women of color. So how do we think about experiences, right? How do we think about, rather than saying like, oh yeah, I used to work with a Latina on my staff, and you're referring to me, the way that's gonna be, the way I show up in my work is gonna be vastly different than somebody else who has my shared identities, right? And so there are lots of things that we can draw upon that help us get some information. So like generalities and things that we might understand, like I just said, it's okay to be mistrusted at first, and not everybody's gonna approach that way, in that same way, right? And so really, how do we think about how we can expand how we expect women of color to show up, right? How do we think about that? And even asking ourselves that question might get to some interesting responses around our own socialization around how we expect women of color to show up and stuff. There are a lot of times where we're in a meeting, and somebody, I think Rachel or both of y'all might have said this, where you say something in a meeting, and after the meeting, somebody, most likely a white person, will come up to me and say, thank you so much. I'm so glad you said that in that meeting. And in that moment, I'm like, you should not be saying thank you. You should be saying sorry. Sorry I didn't say it. Because it is over and over and over, women of color, I see this dynamic all the time in meetings. People catch eyes, and they say, oh, so I think something should be said. And then who says it, right? Oftentimes it's a woman or a woman of color. And what does it cost those folks in those spaces to be the person to always say it? And so when somebody says thank you after meetings, I'm starting to say, okay, what would it have meant for you to say sorry I didn't say it? With folks that I have relationship with, so that we can move the needle, so we can say like, how can we share the responsibility? If you felt something in that meeting, it could have been as easy as saying, can we pause? I have a question here, right? So really thinking about being expansive rather than reductive and saying, oh yeah, old girl's gonna say it because she always does. And how do we share some of that responsibility to move beyond like these thin slices of what we think we are or should be?
Thank you, all three of you, for sharing. Initially, I have to acknowledge that, yes, this is an educative space, so I appreciate the extra burden I've put on you to be able to speak from your own experiences about the things that you go through and face on a regular basis. But I think it's really important for people to understand that those encounters that are laden with microaggressions or implicit bias are the real things that create the additional burden. So some of the burden is just the getting through and having to deal with like, oh, there it is again. It's that death by a thousand cuts, the way that we typically describe microaggressions. But it's also then the additional burden of, do I have to educate you? Do I have to make sure that this is palatable to you? So things like tone policing or other kinds of considerations of how to navigate those spaces all just compound on top of one another. I think that there are multiple things that I want to make sure we get into this space so that people are aware. The educating yourself is an important theme that you have heard, hopefully before even it's been repeated on this panel. And I think that one of the things that is crucial to recognize is that this conversation is almost coded like we're talking to white people and especially white women. And it's okay for us to acknowledge that right now in this space, because for our purposes here, for this panel, for this summit, we're talking about the work that we're doing here at Colorado State University. And the gender work that anybody is engaging in is supposed to be for everyone. So to be speaking to, namely, a lot of white women who may be leading the charges on what are we doing to shift the culture around gender, if there's not an extra consideration around what happens for our programming and the ways that we're showing up with gender in mind, if we're not thinking about women of color, then that is what creates the harm. So it's not something outside of the people who are doing gender work. That harm can actually happen within the work that we're doing here on campus. And so how that couples with educating yourself, I think that's really important, is that it's also not just read books about different people's experiences and recognize you can't clump everybody together in generalizations. But one of the biggest charges that I hear is we have to be able to learn more about ourselves. So if someone coming from dominant identities or whiteness, for instance, it's not just learn about what other people's experiences are and what women of color go through, but learn how you are showing up as a white person. What are the tendencies that happen? That level of education doesn't have to be learn about others, but learn how others see you and experience you is probably one of the most important things that you can start with. Because this isn't just saying, oh, wow, I'm hearing from a lot of women of color. They're very tired and maybe angry, and now I need to cater to that. That's not where that's going. It's going more to an awareness of maybe the stuff that I'm doing is leading to that, and that's not very supportive. So what do I need to see in myself? I think that brings up some things when, Rachel, you said that like you don't often support the gender programming and things because if it's not centering trans and femmes of color, trans women and femmes of color, then that is missing the mark. But I want to hear your comments on what is the role then of having spaces like the Women of Color Luncheon that we have this week or the Women of Color Summit, and what should people be aware of why those things are also necessary, like how we can be supporting women of color by having kind of special spaces. Anybody want
I was just talking about this with a graduate student the other day, about how when I get invited to a women's leadership institute, I am like, ugh. I get a little like nervous in my body because when I envision the places and the times that I've gone to a space where it's like a women's caucus or a women's space, it inevitably becomes super white, or is super white in that space, and super femmy, like feminine. Like a lot of it's talked about how do we dress for success? How are we in relationship with men often, right? There's a lot of things that are centered in really kind of dominant culture in those women's spaces that I often feel like, ugh. And this is not just me, there's lots of across race, across experience that women's spaces often feel a little bit limiting, right? Even though they're supposed to be more like trying to help create space, right? Then when I think about going to a woman of color space, I get really excited. I have less nerves in my body. I still feel a little bit nervous because of the intersections of my other identities and around gender expression and around sexuality, because in those women of color spaces too, there's a more broad, but it's still narrow focused around, again, the way we present in some of those spaces. And when I think about a queer woman of color space, I'm like, I'm down. I don't care what we're doing. If we're crafting, if we're like whatever, I'm like ready to be there, right? Because I feel like I get to be seen in all of my complexity. So when I think about the spaces, the times that we have opportunity to create affinity space, a place that's just, I frame it as not necessarily special, but as like more private. Um, because of a shared experience, we then get to nuance the things that are tough for us, even within that community, without having other folks be onlookers to that conversation, right? We get to nuance, for example, in the women of color space, we could nuance, what does it mean? How do we have expectations around gender in that space from a racialized lens, right? And that if you are not a woman of color in that space, you don't get to participate in that conversation in the same kinds of ways. So the same that way we would have a women's space so that we can contextualize, problematize, and get into the complexities of that, it would be different if we had men in the room, right? Using a binary example. And so I think those private spaces are really important for us to really do our own self-work and to nuance and to get complicated with the ways that we show up in that identity.
I was gonna be like my fourth point, but I limited it to three. But I think it's really important to have an in group. So similar to what Carmen was saying about it being special or being like necessary or private. I think the in group, right, like the in community is so valuable, and just to have this shared, right, just even the like four of us up here, there is already a bond, right? Like we each have shared something that we all have nodded to or been like, yes, I've been there, even though each of our experiences are vastly different, right? But there's still that connecting piece. And I know that at times it can feel exclusive, and I have to say sorry, not sorry, because that's what's needed in order for me to, I'll speak for me, but like to persist and to be here, right? Is I need to be in community with people that share similar identities with me that maybe don't necessarily look like. I came from an institution where I was one of 3 Asian folks in the entire division of student affairs, and those 2 were they were Indian, right? So it was me, and so the students were super excited that I was there. But it was a joke where it's like, well, if I want to see someone looks like me, I gotta look in the mirror, you know. And so being here, the saying is not to go somewhere where it's like that and then come here and be like, yeah, everything's fixed. But you know, I don't take it for granted, and so for me, the space is very private. It is like an in group, and I think about in my department, like who I go to and how I show up my kind of more authentic self for that in that space, and then how immediately the dynamic shifts when we have a white colleague come in. And it's not necessarily like we were talking about them and they come in, but they come in and it's just this like the whole air, the feeling just shifts, and it eventually centers back toward them, right? And so kind of what Carmen was saying, like this space it's shared and it's centered around all of us because of that shared identity. And so I appreciate having those things. I appreciate the opportunities to educate because I understand, you know, like that's why I'm here. And I also love when, you know, there are times when it's like, we're just gonna go and have happy hour or like just have a lunch and talk about how hard it's been to work and you know something that happened, and you know we can laugh about it because we get that I just feel so validated, and really that's like the biggest thing, right, is feeling validated and seen as somebody who I mean, we can get into complexity of race, but right, so I feel like very invisible at times and erased. And so when I'm seen and heard, I can't tell you what that feeling is like. And it just reminds me that that's not what I'm experiencing all the time.
I don't have anything really significant to add. I'm definitely co-signing what both Carmen and Stephanie shared. But yeah, those spaces are really soul recharging, and they're so important because doing the work of social justice and advocacy is exhausting. And it's so important, especially for me for all women. But I know for me as an introvert, I really I get so exhausted doing this work, and I need that space because it is a soul recharging space. And for me, it's the Native Women's Circle. Every week I go there, and it doesn't matter what we're doing, if we're beading, if we're making ribbon skirts, if you know whatever it is, if we're going out to dinner, it's just nice to be able to relax and like take off the armor for a little bit and have that space and be able to laugh and share humor and share jokes that maybe we wouldn't share in other spaces, but it's okay to do in that space. That yeah, that space is so soul recharging, and it really makes the important work that we do possible.
I would also add in those spaces, I'd kind of connected to what you're saying is like I don't have to translate myself in a way that you do when it's like a lot mixed groups, right? So I've been, like I said, I've been at CSU for a long time, and I can probably dozens, if not more, times I've had people, white people, tell me after they've gotten to know me a little bit, I was so intimidated by you. You were so intimidating when I first met you. And I'm like, what? Me? Why? How? Like, I legit enter every room with a smile. And like, if you ever been in a meeting with me, you know it's hard for me to keep me on task because I'm always got jokes. And so I'm like, how on earth could you have been receiving intimidating from me? I have no idea how that's true. Then I keep getting those messages, right? In a woman of color space, nobody thinks that about me. Nobody sees me that way. I do not have to translate why I sit with my arms crossed, or my sarcasm, or my fashion, or the way I wear my hair, or the size of my earrings, or the way I speak Spanglish. I don't have to translate that in women of color spaces, even though not everybody speaks Spanglish, not everybody wears their hair like me, not everybody flashes their lipstick and stunts in a room like that, right? Like everybody sees me for just the way I am in that space, right? And it's complicated there too, but I don't have to translate in that space, and that's really important for me.
I think one thing that I'm hearing in the comments is like that there's a noticeable shift in the atmosphere in spaces that women of color can be aware of that maybe white women are not. And to feel that maybe people are intimidated when they meet you, Carmen, I have thought about that kind of phenomenon, and I think it's maybe not so much intimidated as like literally uncomfortable. That either someone could be uncomfortable because they don't know if they are going to assume things or misstep or say something inappropriate, or they could be uncomfortable because they actually are grappling with bias that they may be unaware of. And that's an internal kind of experience that it's good for anybody who maybe has that experience to check themselves and notice it, and then go take some time and like keep thinking about it. What was going on there? Why am I uncomfortable? Do I change my behavior around women of color in a certain kind of way? And if you track patterns that say yes, then those are all indications to say then maybe there's some more work to be thinking about and keep educating yourself on.
Yeah, I can't help but think when this like 6'5" cis hetero white dude was looking literally down on me as we're standing, he's like, I was so intimidated by you. And I'm like, yo, I don't even know why you're telling me that out loud, because like of who you are in the world, right? And so, yeah, that self-work is really important there, connecting to what you were saying.
Thanks. So we have just like a couple of minutes left. So I'm wondering if there's anything after sharing and talking a little bit more that there is like one thing that you wish everybody could do. Like something that is like, here's the thing. Check yourself in this way. And it's okay if you don't, but if there's something that is like a drive home message or a takeaway task for folks, this would be a good time to share it.
So kind of what Carmen was saying, there might be mistrust, and should the time come when someone, a woman of color, femme of color, trusts you to share an experience or a story, your initial response will probably be a shock, and you'll want to say like, "No way, are you sure?" Like, "Whoa," right? And I need you to like pause and check that, because they're telling it to you, it did happen, it's true. And I get that the shock is kind of like I want to share this pain or like whatever, but hearing that sometimes it's the invalidation. And so just hearing that and just having a statement of like, that was super shitty and I'm really sorry that happened, and right, like I don't know what to say, but I'm here, and right, just being heard is so important. So I think that's that's the piece I would leave, is just listen, and like really listen, right? So it's not listening to respond, but listening and kind of getting a sense of like checking in of like, okay, what are they needing? And right now they're needing someone. They just shared this really vulnerable thing with you that I know, and probably could speak for all of us, that we have probably had invalidated for us many, many times experiences. And so just hearing that and just being like, that really sucks. You just to be seen like that means a lot.
Kind of along those same lines, when you do make a mistake, because we all make mistakes, I certainly have several dominant identities where I sometimes step in it. I think what's usually what's more important than the mistake that you made is how you respond to it, how you address it, especially if it's brought up to you. Not getting defensive initially, actually being willing to hear the person who's naming what happened, and really take that in. And if your initial response is to get defensive, sit with that before you act on that initial response. That can be more important than the harm that was initially done a lot of the time.
And both of those patterns that you're naming are actually, I think, things that women of color would say, and those are things that white women do all the time. So even those responses, well intended as they may be, can actually be reflective of a kind of white socialized response itself that people may not be aware of.
Yeah, I even think about the, I don't know if, I guess entitlement folks feel, white folks in particular, about having access to everything in terms of asking any question under the clear blue sky, expecting to, so like if you ask a question of somebody and somebody says to you, not in the mood to answer that, don't feel like I can have that conversation with you as a person, or be like, give you some kind of quick, short answer, it's probably an indicator that there was, you asked a question that was not like in a place of trust with that person, right? So how I entered that space, this conversation around mistrust that's a reasonable response to experiencing oppression in our lives, right? I liken it to if I, as a woman, go into a bath. Not that this has ever happened. If I accidentally go into a men's bathroom, and I realize it once I get there, I'm like, ah! Right? It's not because I am specifically looking at those men in that room, that bathroom, feeling like they're going to hurt me, but in general, we have a socialization around not going into men's spaces around safety as a woman, right? So we are actually taught overtly to be mistrustful of spaces, like put the keys between your fingers while you walk to your car, those kinds of things. We're actually taught that, and we think, oh, that's okay, that makes sense. But when we think about race, we don't think about it in that way. And so the ways in which we engage race is like, I am not a racist, but when we start to talk about behaviors that come from a white socialized world, we don't want to distance ourselves from that. And so really about that kind mind is like coupled with the listening piece is to stop and like be quiet and hear before we jump into a place of like, yeah, but I'm a really good person, or why would you not trust me? I have been nice to you, right? That sometimes it's not about you, the person in front of us. It's really about a broader system of it and an experience that we've had in the world that makes us be this way in this space. And part of that is us too, like having to say, that's what it is for me. And naming that truth rather than trying to then also take care of the person whose feelings have been hurt by feedback that's just honest, and it's about behaviors and not making you be a bad person, if that makes sense.
For information, if anybody is looking, like, where can I go to learn more about intersectionality and some of these issues, especially as they show up in higher ed, I want to remind you that the Women and Gender Collaborative's website has a section called Educate Yourself, so that you can take on that responsibility. We update those articles constantly, and there's even a subcategory that you can look at too that has why intersectionality matters, as one to keep abreast of different ways in which issues affect people of all sorts of identities differently. There's also a new program available online called Introducing Feminist Frameworks that's available through CSU Online, and employees get a special discount so that you can take 2 courses with modules for $52. And a lot of the topics that are covered in there are around understanding intersectionality and white women and women of color and how to better work together across different. So these themes are embedded in those course modules, and it's a very easy class. It's not like academic in any real way, other than the scholarly readings are very academic. But those are available to you all for resources to continue thinking about these issues and educating yourselves on like how we can all do better. Thank you for being a part of the panel, Carmen, Stephanie, and Rachel. Would you all please join me in thanking them for what they've shared?